I switched the cups. That's where I want to start, because that's the moment everything in my life either ended or began, depending on how you look at it. My hands were steady, steadier than they had any right to be for a man of 68 whose only living son had just walked into the kitchen carrying a small brown bottle in his coat pocket like it was a roll of breath mints. The kettle was whistling. I remember that because I've been staring at it without really hearing it, the way you stare at a stoplight when you've already decided you're going to run it. My son's wife was in the dining room, fussing with the placemats she'd brought over from her side of the family, the ones with the cranberries embroidered into the corners. Thanksgiving was 3 days off. The house smelled like sage and onions because I'd been browning sausage for the dressing earlier in the day, the way my late wife used to do it, and I had not stopped doing it just because she was gone. A man keeps cooking. That's one of the things nobody tells you. You keep cooking even when there's nobody left to feed. My son came in and put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I wanted some hot tea. And I said yes, and he poured 2 cups from the kettle, and then he turned his back to me to get the honey out of the cupboard, and that's when his wife came in from the dining room and gave him a look. Just a look, the kind of look 2 people share when they think the third person isn't watching. Only I was watching, because the cabinet door above the stove has a glass panel, and I've been staring at the reflection without quite knowing why for about 3 weeks now. She nodded. He nodded back, and then his hand went into his coat pocket, and out came the little brown bottle, and 3 drops went into the cup on the left, and he gave it a quick stir with the spoon, and he turned around with both cups and a smile that I had known since he was 4 years old. Here you go, Pop. Got the chamomile, just like you like. I took the cup on the left. I held it. I watched his eyes go to the cup, and then to my mouth, and then to the cup again, and I knew. I have spent my whole life reading people for a living, 41 years selling commercial real estate in Central Ohio. And you don't last that long in that business if you can't tell when a man is lying to you about his back taxes. My son was lying with his whole face. I asked him if he'd join me. I said it gentle, the way an old man says things when he wants the world to think he's slipping. I said, "Sit with your old dad a minute, son. Got something I want to tell you about your mother." He blinked. He was holding his own cup, the one on the right. He hesitated, just for a half second, and his wife in the doorway said too quickly, "Honey, didn't you say you had to take that call from work?" He set his cup down on the counter. Yeah, Pop. Give me 5 minutes. I'll be right back. Don't let it get cold." He left the kitchen. She followed him. I heard their footsteps go up the stairs to the guest room they'd been staying in for the past 4 months, ever since they'd lost the house in Powell, that they could never afford in the first place. I switched the cups. I didn't think about it. There was no inner monologue, no agonized debate. My hands moved the way they used to move when I was tying flies for trout fishing on the Mad River with my own father back in 1968. Muscle memory. I picked up his cup, I picked up mine, and I switched them, and I sat down at the kitchen table with the doctored one in front of me, and I waited. He came back down. She came with him. They sat across from me at the table where I had eaten breakfast every single morning for 36 years, and my son raised his cup, and he said, "To Mom, to Eleanor." He never called her Eleanor while she was alive. He called her Mom. The fact that he called her by her name now, like she was a stranger he'd read about in the obituaries, told me everything I already knew. I raised mine. I touched my lips to it. I let the warm tea wet my mouth, and then I set it down without swallowing, and I watched my son drink his own poison. He didn't drink much, just a sip. He was nervous, and the smile on his wife's face was the smile of a woman who has gotten very, very used to lying. She was watching me, not him. She wanted to see me drink, so I drank. Or I appeared to. I tilted the cup. I made the swallowing sound. I set it down. I dabbed my mouth with a napkin, and into that napkin I let the mouthful drain. I'd practiced it. You laugh, but I practiced it standing at the kitchen sink for 2 nights running. Ever since the morning I'd opened the laundry hamper looking for one of my undershirts, and instead found a receipt from a pharmacy in Springfield, 2 towns over, for something called digoxin. I looked it up. Digoxin, in the right dose, helps the heart. In the wrong dose, it stops one. And I had been complaining for 6 weeks about how tired I was getting, how my legs felt heavy on the stairs, how I'd had to sit down in the hardware store the other day. My son had been so concerned, he'd driven me to the doctor himself. He'd made me an appointment with a specialist his wife knew, a cardiologist out of a strip mall in Springfield, a man who'd taken one look at me and said my numbers were concerning, and started writing me prescriptions for things I'd never heard of. The pills had been making me sick. Of course they had. They weren't for me. They were against me. I sat at that table on a Monday afternoon in November, and I drank pretend tea, and I watched my son make small talk about the Buckeyes' chances in the playoff, while 3 drops of something I couldn't even pronounce sat in his stomach. I watched his color change. I watched a thin sheen come up on his upper lip. I watched his wife's face slowly start to figure out that something was off, about how the room felt, even if she couldn't say what. He stood up. He said he didn't feel so good. He said he was going to lie down. I said, "You go right ahead, son. Get some rest. I'll clean up here." He went up the stairs. She went with him. I poured both cups down the drain. I rinsed them. I put them in the dishwasher. I walked over to the kitchen phone, the old beige one mounted to the wall that my wife had refused to let me get rid of, even when everyone in the world had a cell phone, and I dialed a number I had not dialed in, 11 years but had never forgotten. It rang twice. Carter and Associates. "This is Walter Hennessy," I said. "Tell Jim it's the call I told him about. Tell him it's tonight." There was a pause on the other end. Then the receptionist, a woman whose voice I didn't recognize, said, "He's been waiting, sir. They'll meet you at the diner in 45 minutes. I hung up. I went upstairs. I knocked on the guest room door. I asked my son if he wanted me to call an ambulance. He said no, it was just something he ate. He'd be fine. His wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, with her hand on his back, and her face when she looked up at me was a face I will remember for the rest of my life. Because it was the face of a woman who was trying very hard to look worried about her husband, and not at all worried about anything else. And she was failing on both counts. I told them I had to run out to the pharmacy. I said I'd be back in an hour. I drove to the diner on Route 40. I had not seen Jim Carter in 11 years. We'd grown up together in Urbana. 2 farm boys who'd both left for the army and then both come home to make our lives in a 30-mile radius of where we'd been born. He'd made his in-law, and I'd made mine in dirt, but we'd stayed close until my wife got sick and I got tired, and we drifted the way men drift when one of them is nursing his wife through ovarian cancer and the other one doesn't know what to say. He was a few years older than me, and he'd retired the year before, but his name was still on the door because his son ran the firm now. He was in the corner booth. He had 2 cups of coffee in front of him and a pie I didn't recognize. "Walt," he said. "Jim, tell me." I told him. I told him about the receipt I'd found. I told him about the cardiologist in the strip mall. I told him about the pills that had been making me sick. I told him about the conversation I had overheard 3 weeks earlier, when I'd come home from the grocery store quieter than usual because I'd left the keys in the front door and didn't want to ring the bell, and I had heard my son's wife in the kitchen saying, "How long, baby? How long are we supposed to wait?" And my son had said, "The doctor says by Christmas, easy. Probably Thanksgiving." I told him about today. The bottle. The cups. The switch. He listened the whole way through. He didn't interrupt once. He's a lawyer, Jim is, but he's the kind of lawyer who became a lawyer because he liked listening to people, not the kind who became one because he liked hearing himself talk. When I was done, he set down his coffee. "Walt, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to think before you answer. Did your son drink that tea?" A sip. Maybe 2. "Is he alive?" "He was 20 minutes ago." "Then we're going to keep him that way. And we're going to put him and that woman somewhere where they can think real long and hard about what they tried to do." I asked him what I needed to do. He said, "I need you to drive home. I need you to throw away nothing. I need you to bag up that napkin you spit the tea into, and the cups if they're still in the dishwasher, and any pill bottle in your house that doesn't belong to you. I need you to write down every single thing you remember, every appointment, every receipt, every word of every conversation, and I need you to do it tonight while it's fresh. And tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, you and I are going to walk into the sheriff's office in Champaign County together, and we are going to make a report. But Walt, listen to me. You keep being old and tired and confused tonight. You don't say a word to that boy or his wife. You let them think they got away with it. Can you do that? I told him I'd been doing it for 3 weeks already. He put his hand on my arm. He said, Walt, I am so sorry. I didn't cry. I have not cried since the morning my wife died. And I did not cry that night either. Not in the diner and not on the drive home, and not when I walked back into my own house and saw my son sitting up at the kitchen table, eating a piece of toast like nothing had happened, because the dose he'd taken hadn't been enough to kill a grown man, only to make him sick for a couple of hours. And his wife had clearly already figured out that he must have gotten the wrong cup, and they were both watching me now with new eyes. Pop, my son said. You feeling okay? You look pale. Long day, son, I said. I'm going to bed. I went up the stairs. I closed my bedroom door. I sat down on the edge of the bed where my wife had died, and I put my face in my hands, and I did not cry, but I shook for a long time. I should tell you about my son, because I owe him that much even now. His name is, well, let me just call him my son. Let me call her his wife. They don't deserve their names in my mouth anymore, and I'm not going to give them to you. He was a sweet boy. He really was. He used to ride on my shoulders at the county fair. He used to come into the office with me on Saturdays when he was 8 or 9, and he'd sit in the swivel chair behind my desk and pretend to take phone calls from imaginary clients, and I would let him sign the easements with a fat green crayon. He played baseball. Not well, but with heart. He cried at his grandmother's funeral when he was 11, and he asked me, in the parking lot of the church, whether everyone died eventually, and I told him yes, and he asked if I would die, and I told him yes, but not for a long, long time, because his old man was made of sturdier stuff than that. I meant it when I said it, and then I almost wasn't. He met his wife at a sales conference in Indianapolis when he was 31. She was working the registration table. She was pretty in the way that made other women narrow their eyes a little, and from the very first dinner I had with her, I could tell she did not like me, and the dislike was specific. It wasn't that she didn't like older men or fathers-in-law or Ohioans. It was that she didn't like me. She sized me up at that dinner. The watch on my wrist that my own father had given me, the cars in the driveway, the size of the house. And from then on, every conversation she had with me had a price tag floating somewhere behind her eyes. I let it go. I told my wife I didn't trust her. My wife told me I was being the snub. She said, "Honey, our son is happy. Let him be happy." So I let him be happy. They got married on a Saturday in May at a winery up in Geneva on the lake. I paid for the wedding because her family didn't have the money, which was fine. That's what you do. But she never thanked me. Not once. Not at the rehearsal dinner. Not at the reception. Not in the 7 years that followed. She thanked me for the Christmas checks, which got bigger every year because she made it clear to my son that they needed them, but she never thanked me for the wedding. I noticed. And I held my tongue because my wife had asked me to. My wife got sick in the spring of the year I turned 63. She fought for a year and a half. Our son came to the hospital twice. His wife came once for 40 minutes, and she spent most of it on her phone in the hallway. When my wife died, on a Tuesday in October, my son cried at the funeral, and his wife wore a black dress that she'd clearly bought for the occasion, and posted a photo of herself in it on her social media, with a caption about how loss makes us stronger. I saw the photo because a friend's daughter showed it to me. I did not say anything. For the first year after my wife died, I lived alone. I ate cereal for dinner. I let the lawn get long. I didn't open her closet. I went to work 3 days a week, and the rest of the time I sat in the den and watched golf with the sound off. My son called me every Sunday. He was a good son that year. I'll give him that. He was a good son right up until the moment his wife realized that I was 65 and worth somewhere north of $2.5 million between the house, the commercial properties, the IRA, and the life insurance my wife had left me, and that I was the only thing standing between her and a very different life. That's when she started planting the idea. I can see it now, looking back. The phone calls got more frequent. The visits got longer. They started bringing up, casual at first, that maybe I was lonely, that maybe a big house wasn't safe for a man my age, that maybe I should think about downsizing, that maybe it would be nice if they came and stayed with me for a while, when their house in Powell went into foreclosure, because of course it did, because they had bought a house they couldn't afford on the assumption that money was always going to come from somewhere. They didn't even ask. They just showed up with a U-Haul on a Saturday morning in July and announced that they were going to stay with me for a few weeks, just until we get back on our feet. That was 4 months before the day with the cups. In those 4 months, my health declined in ways that bewildered me. I got tired walking up my own stairs. My heart raced for no reason. I got dizzy in the shower one morning and had to grab the towel rack. My son was so worried. He drove me to that cardiologist. He picked up my prescriptions himself because he didn't want me out in the cold. He brought me my pills with breakfast every morning and a glass of water, and he stood there and watched me take them. Stood there and watched me. I am not a stupid man. I want to be clear about that. I am not a stupid man, and I am not a vain one, but I had buried my wife only 2 years before, and my only child was the only person in the world I had left. And you cannot, look at the boy you taught to ride a bicycle in 1980 and think to yourself, he is killing me. Until you do. The morning I found the receipt was a Thursday. They'd gone out, the two of them, to look at a business opportunity they'd been excited about. I went into their bathroom because the one in my room was clogged, and I dropped my undershirt in the laundry basket, and the receipt was on top, half folded. I almost didn't read it, but I've been a businessman my whole life, and I read every piece of paper I see. That's just how I'm built. Springfield Discount Pharmacy. Patient Walter Hennessy. Digoxin. Door 0.25 milligrams, 90 CT. I had never been to that pharmacy. I had never been prescribed digoxin. I sat down on the closed lid of the toilet and stared at that receipt for what felt like an hour. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I went down to the kitchen and I opened the cabinet where my pills were, the ones my son brought me every morning. I took the bottle out. The label said it was a generic blood pressure medication prescribed by the cardiologist in the strip mall. I knew, looking at it, that I had no way of knowing what was actually inside. I went online. I read about digoxin. I read about the symptoms of digoxin toxicity. Fatigue, dizziness, heart palpitations, confusion, visual disturbances. I had been having every single one of them for 6 weeks. I sat at the kitchen table at 1 a.m, and I made a decision. I did not confront him. I did not call the police. I did not call Jim Carter. Not yet. I needed to know with certainty that this was what I thought it was, because if I was wrong, if there was some innocent explanation, some clerical error at a pharmacy I'd never been to, I would lose my son forever for no reason. And I could not bear to lose him for no reason, so I got smart instead. The next morning, when my son brought me my pill, I held it under my tongue until he left the room, and then I spit it into a tissue and put it in a plastic bag in the back of my sock drawer. I did this every morning for 2 weeks. I had 14 pills in a baggie. I drove out to Columbus on a Tuesday, and I went to a lab. I told them I was a worried family member who suspected an elderly relative was being given the wrong medication. I paid in cash. They tested 2 of the pills. Digoxin. 0.5 milligrams each. Twice the dose he claimed I was taking. Enough to slowly poison a man with a healthy heart and, look, on autopsy, like simple cardiac failure of an old man who'd been recently widowed. I drove home. I went into my bathroom. I threw up. Then I washed my face, and I went downstairs, and I asked my son if he wanted to go fishing with me that weekend, because I thought it was important that I see him, really see him, while I still had the strength. He said he was busy. He said maybe next weekend. He kept his eyes on his phone the whole time he said it. That was the moment I called Jim Carter. Not for the first time, but for the first time in earnest. Jim and I had a friendship that went back 50-some years. And when he picked up the phone, he didn't ask me how I was doing. He asked me what was wrong. I told him I needed to come see him. I told him it was about my son. I told him I might be in trouble. He said, "Come tomorrow." I drove to his house. He lives out in the country now, on a few acres he and his wife bought when he retired. We sat on his back porch and I told him everything. And I gave him the baggie, and I gave him the lab results, and I gave him the receipt I'd taken from the laundry basket and made a copy of, and put back exactly where I'd found it. He looked at it all. He took a long time. Then he said, "Walt, we can go to the police right now, today. With what you've got, they will arrest him by sundown." I said, "I know." He said, "But you don't want to." I said, "I want to know what they were planning. I want to know all of it. I want to know if it was just him or if it was her, and how long they'd been at it, and where they thought they were going to go after. I want to be sure, Jim. I don't want to put my own son in prison because of one bad decision and a pharmacy receipt. I want to be sure." He nodded. He said, "Then we wait. We wait, and we watch, and we make sure. But Walt, and I'm not saying this lightly, we have to give it a hard end date, because every day you walk around in that house, you are walking around with people who want you dead, and I am not going to bury you, brother. I will not do it." We agreed on 3 weeks. 3 weeks to gather everything I could. 3 weeks of being old and tired and confused and trusting and listening and watching and writing it all down. In 3 weeks I learned the following. I learned that my son and his wife had taken out a life insurance policy on me 11 months earlier, naming themselves as joint beneficiaries, for an amount that was almost exactly equal to their debt. They had done this by walking into a small insurance office in West Jefferson with a power of attorney form they had forged, using a notary stamp from a girl who worked at a UPS store who I am told is now also under indictment. I learned this because my son's wife kept the policy paperwork in the drawer of the nightstand on her side of the guest bed, and I went into that room one afternoon when they had gone to a movie, and I photographed every page of every document in that drawer with my phone. I learned that they had been talking on and off for months about a place in Sarasota, a condo on the water. They had a realtor down there, a woman whose name and email I found in his phone when he left it charging on the counter one night. They told her they were expecting a windfall by the end of the year, possibly sooner. I learned that the cardiologist in the strip mall in Springfield was not a real cardiologist. He was a real doctor. Barely, but his license was on probation in Ohio and he was running the practice as a cash-only operation out of a building that had been a tanning salon 2 years before. My son had paid him a flat fee in cash to write prescriptions. I learned that my son's wife had a brother who had done 18 months in Marion for fraud, and that he had introduced her to the doctor. I learned, hardest of all, that this had not been a moment of weakness or a crime of passion. This was a plan that they had been building for almost a year, a plan that involved my death by Thanksgiving, the collection of my life insurance by Christmas, the sale of my house by spring, and a new life on the Gulf Coast by summer. I wrote it all down. I wrote it in a leather notebook I kept in the safe in my office, the one my son did not know the combination to, the one that had been my father's. I wrote it like I was writing a will, because in a way I was writing the will of the love I had for my son, which had to die now because he had killed it. He had killed it with a brown bottle and a coffee cup and a smile he learned from me when he was 4 years old. The day with the cups was the last day of my 3 weeks. I had told Jim, I had told him the night before, I had told him I thought they were going to try something soon because my son had been getting nervous and his wife had been getting impatient, and the way they looked at each other across the dinner table had a calculating quality to it that even an old man in cardiac decline could read. I had told Jim I thought it would be soon. He had told me to be careful and to call him the second something happened. When my son went out to the back porch to take a phone call that morning, I went into his coat pocket. The brown bottle was there. I unscrewed the cap. I sniffed it. I put one drop on my finger and touched it to my tongue, and then spit into the sink. Bitter. Plant-based, I think. Not the digoxin anymore. Something faster. Something that was meant to be the finish. I went down to the basement. I had an old amber tincture bottle from when my wife had made her own herbal tinctures back in the 90s. The same size, the same brown glass. I rinsed it out. I filled it with water and a drop of soy sauce, just enough to give it a color. I went back upstairs and I switched bottles. The bottle in his coat pocket, when he reached for it that afternoon, contained nothing but water and a drop of soy sauce. He poisoned my tea that day with 3 drops of soy sauce water. And then I switched the cups anyway, because I wanted him to drink it. I wanted him to take a sip of what he had intended for me. And I wanted to watch his face when he realized, when he felt nothing at all, that something had gone very, very wrong. He didn't get sick from poison. He got sick from fear. He got sick because halfway through that sip he realized that the taste was off, that it tasted like dishwater, that something was wrong, and his mind went where guilty minds always go, which is to the worst place. He thought he had been caught. He thought he had been outsmarted. He didn't know how. He didn't know by whom, but he knew, and the knowing made him sweat, and the sweat made his wife look at him, and her looking at him made me, finally, after 3 weeks of being old and tired and confused, smile a small private smile down into my own teacup. The next morning, at 8 o'clock sharp, I was sitting in the lobby of the Champaign County Sheriff's Office, with Jim Carter beside me, and a manila folder on my lap that contained 3 weeks of evidence, and a lifetime of love turned into something else. The deputy who took our statement was a young man, maybe 30, with a gentle face. When I got to the part about the cups, he stopped writing and looked at me and said, "Sir, you are a remarkable man." I told him I wasn't. I told him I wasn't. I told him I was just a father. They arrested both of them that afternoon. They came to my house with a warrant. My son was in the kitchen making a sandwich. His wife was upstairs. He cried when they put the cuffs on him. He turned to me and said, "Pop, Pop, please, I can explain." And I looked at him and I said the only thing I had left in me to say to him, which was, "No, you can't." The trial took 14 months to come to its conclusion. Jim's son represented me since Jim wasn't taking new cases anymore. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s who had worked elder abuse cases for a decade and who told me, in the hallway outside the courtroom on the first day, that this was one of the most well-documented cases of attempted murder by a family member that she had ever seen. She said it quietly, the way you say something kind to someone who is grieving. Because that is what I was. I was grieving. My son took a plea. So did his wife. They did not want to risk the trial, because the evidence was, in the prosecutor's words, comprehensive. My son got 18 years, his wife got 22, because she was the one who had forged the power of attorney, and that was a separate federal matter on top of the conspiracy and the attempted murder. The cardiologist lost his license and got 6 years. The brother-in-law caught a charge for being the middleman. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I sat in the front row. I wore the suit I'd worn to my wife's funeral. My son looked back at me one time, just once, when the judge was reading out the sentence, and his face was the face of a child. I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I just looked at him, and I let him see me, all of me, the man he had tried to kill and the man he had failed to kill. And after a long moment he turned away and he did not look at me again. I drove home that afternoon. The house was quiet. I made a pot of coffee, because that's what you do, and I sat at the kitchen table where I had switched the cups, and I drank it slowly, and I watched the snow come down through the window over the sink. The first snow of the year. Late November. I thought about my wife. I thought about how, If she were still alive, none of this would have happened, because she would have seen it coming a year earlier than I did, the way she always saw things a year earlier than I did. I thought about how I had failed her by failing to see what she would have seen, and I thought about how I had also, in the end, not failed her, because the boy we made together was alive, and he was going to have to live with what he had tried to do, and that was, in its own awful way, a kind of mercy. I sold the house in the spring. I couldn't stay in it. I bought a smaller place over in Yellow Springs, a one-story with a garden in the back, and I started taking a watercolor class at the community center on Wednesday nights. Most of the students are women in their 70s. They are very kind to me. One of them, a widow named, well, I'll let her keep her name to herself. She sometimes brings me cookies. We are not anything. We are friends. At my age, friendship is a fine thing. I have not visited my son in prison. He has written me 4 letters. I have not opened them. They sit in a drawer in the kitchen, unopened, and someday I may open them, and someday I may not. I have not decided. Jim told me I don't have to decide anything for a long time, and I am taking him up on that. I drove out of the courthouse parking lot the day of the sentencing, and on the road home I rolled down the window, and I took the little brown tincture bottle out of my coat pocket. The real one. The one I had taken from my son's coat that morning a year and a half before. The one that had been in evidence and was now back in my possession. And I dropped it into a culvert by the side of Route 68. I watched it disappear into the gray slush. I rolled up the window. I turned on the radio. There was a country song playing, an old one my wife used to like, and I sang along. Soft, all the way home. That's the story. That's all of it. I tell it now, because I am 70 years old, and at 70, a man starts to think about what he is going to leave behind, and what I want to leave behind is this, the truth, the whole of it, the part where my son tried to kill me, and the part where I let him live anyway, because, in the end, I am still his father, and a father's the man who decides when the moment comes whether the cup goes left or right. I switched the cups. And I am still here, and every morning, when I wake up, I am still here, and the coffee is still warm, and the snow is still falling, and somewhere out there, in a cell in Lebanon, my only child is still alive because I let him be. That is the only revenge I ever wanted. Not his death. Just my own life. Just one more morning, and another after that, and another after that. The kettle is whistling now as I finish this. I'm going to go pour myself a cup. Just one cup. There's nobody here to switch it with anymore. And that, somehow, is all right. I have spent a lot of quiet mornings in this little house in Yellow Springs, thinking about how a boy I taught to ride a bicycle ended up across a kitchen table from me with 3 drops of poison in a coffee cup. And the answer I keep coming back to is not mysterious. It is not some twist of fate. It is the simple, hard truth that every choice a person makes is a seed, and every seed grows into exactly the plant it was always going to be. My son did not wake up one morning and decide to kill his father. He drifted there, one small surrender at a time. He married a woman who looked at me like a balance sheet, and he chose, every single day, not to correct her. He bought a house he could not afford, and he chose, every single day, not to live within his means. He took my Christmas checks, and he chose, every single day, not to feel grateful. Each of those small choices was a step down a staircase that ended in a brown bottle in his coat pocket. Nobody pushed him. He walked. And his wife walked beside him, encouraging every step, because she had done the same thing in her own life, and she had no map for any other direction. I think about my own choices too. I was not blameless. I gave too much and asked for too little. I let my wife, may she rest, tell me to keep my mouth shut about a daughter-in-law I did not trust, and I obeyed her because I loved her. But obedience is not always the same as wisdom. A father who refuses to set a hard line is a father who teaches his children that there is no line. I taught my son that, and he learned the lesson too well. What saved me was not luck. It was the three things my own father drilled into me on the farm in Urbana when I was 7 years old. He told me a man needs to be honest enough to see what is in front of him, even when it breaks his heart. He told me a man needs to be smart enough to wait, to gather, to think, instead of swinging at the first thing that moves. And he told me a man needs the spine to act when the moment finally comes, no matter who is on the other side of it. Honesty, intelligence, and grit. He said those three things hold a life together the way three legs hold up a stool, and if you take any one of them away, the whole thing falls. I had to use all three. I had to be honest enough to admit my own boy was trying to kill me. I had to be smart enough to gather evidence instead of confronting him in a rage. And I had to find the grit, at 68 years old and grieving my wife, to walk into that sheriff's office and end my own son's freedom. None of it was easy. None of it felt good. But I am still here. The kettle still whistles in the morning, and that, I have come to believe, is what a life well lived actually looks like at the end.